Hello and welcome to Mr. Quaker's Teachers. In this lesson, I'll be talking about the predicted questions, what I think are the predicted questions with what I've looked at for the questions that have been given for 2023 for the poems from the 19th and 20th century, all 15 poems, part 2. And then I'll also be giving essay questions as well, essay answers to the questions that I'm given. I'll give you a sample of the essay, an A-star quality sample of the essay that can fetch you an A-star in either if you're writing the GCSE, that's if you're in the UK, or maybe you're writing it as the IGCSE, maybe in any other country in the world. My plan is that around this period, some of the students are already running around trying to, because the poetry portion of the exam is quite cumbersome. I mean, you have to deal with 15 poems, and the examiners only bring 2 of those questions, so it's quite a strain on students. So my plan is to write out all the answers, essay answers for the questions, and then you can look at them, practice them, and then own them, so that when you're sitting in the exam, for example, and you're giving any of the questions, you can easily write an A-star quality essay and then just get an A-star. Right, so I've done all the heavy lifting for you, and the essays are going to be, you're going to find the essays on my website, where I sell it for only the poetry sum of £35. So just £35. So you can look at it. But then I'm going to give the sample here for the planners by Bo Kim Cheng. Now, in terms of the essays, because that's what I've realized. I mean, I've taught the GCSE for about 14 years. That's where most students struggle, And then the reason why they struggle is that when they are sitting in the exam, they do not know what style to write in. So some people, for example, some of the teachers will say write in the PEE system, PEL, and then PEA. My personal preference is the PE. And then recently, when I went to for a course, the facilitator also mentioned that a certain Miss Anne mentioned that she prefers the PEA system, so the point evidence analysis. So I'm going to give you sample essays for all of these essay styles, just in case, depending on your preference or what you're used to. Now, one of the first poems that we are going to see is The Planners by Bo Kim Cheng, and by now you should have known the poem, right? And this is really, really key, because sometimes students go to the exam, the GCSE, because they put all the questions together. They answer questions that are not part of the 15 poems that they have to study. Now, they are going to mark you and give you the marks for it, but then it means that you're not very, very familiar with the question. Now, for Bo Kim Cheng's, for example, this is the question that I've put down. How does Cheng powerfully convey his attitude to the activities of the planners in this poem? Now, in the GCSE stroke IGCSE, this Cheng, in terms of the planners, I looked at it. About 14 of the poems have been brought, except one. The only poem that has not been brought is the Consumer's Report. Maybe it was brought in March 2024. I do not know. But the question that was brought was, how does Cheng create such disturbing impressions of the city in the planners? But my predicted question that they are going to ask is, how does Cheng powerfully convey his attitude to the activities of the planners in this poem? Now, this is a really, really key poem, because when you look at the first stanza of the poem, it's in 9 lines. The second stanza is in 14 lines. I talk about the structure in the essay as well, and then the final stanza is 4. Now, in the first stanza, what I see about Cheng is that he repeats the word day, and then talks about be, build, and then plan, which is a combination of the third person plural point of view, which he repeats multiple times. They, about 6 times in the poem, and then plan and build. Now, if you observe, it says they plan, they build. That's short sentence. So he begins the poem with a twin short sentences to create the impression that it takes a very short time for the people who are the planners to plan and then to build. So they do not waste a lot of time. And that's really key. And I think his tone as he speaks about it, you can see that he's a bit irritated by their actions, right? And then towards the later portions of it, he talks about all spaces are gridded, filled with permutations of possibility. He begins to talk about the work that is done by the group. But then if you observe it, in the 3rd and the 4th to the 5th line, in fact, from the 3rd to the 6th line of the first stanza, he talks about the mastery of the planners. The buildings are in alignment with the roads. That sort of, it's like a thumbs up for the activities of the planners, which meet at desired points, linked by bridges all hung in the grace of mathematics. So you see there that he sort of is giving a thumbs up, or for whatever it's worth. He's not critiquing the actions, the activities of the planets because of their lack of mastery. Instead, he's saying that they are doing too much. And one of the key things I want you to take out of this is that there's this sense that he's talking about their obsession with perfection, right? They're obsessed with perfection. They build and will not stop. That tells us that they are always working, always working, always working. Then he ends the first stanza with twin personification. Even the sea draws back and the sky surrender. Then he goes on to use metaphors of dentistry, talks about how they knock off the useless block with dental dexterity, all gaps are plugged. That's metaphors of dental dexterity. Now, then he goes on, the metaphors of dentistry, metaphors of dentistry, you see it multiple times when he begins to talk about dentition, all gaps are plugged with gleaming gold, the country wears perfect rows of shiny teeth. Then he uses a combination of what I've described as climax and listing, anesthesia, amnesia, hypnosis. Now, in the final stanza, he stands defiantly. So we see the tone of defiance. So now he's no longer critiquing their actions as such. He is saying that I'm going to stand in defiance against the activities of this group. So what they are doing, I will not be in support of them. I won't stand in support of them. But my heart will not bleed poetry, not a single drop, to stain the blueprint of our past tomorrow. So you hear the tone there of defiance there. Now, look at the question here. The question is, how does Cheng powerfully convey his attitude to the activities of the planets in this poem? So now, one of the things I've done in the introduction here is that I've listed the points that I'm going to use. So usually when I'm teaching students, I tell them to always begin the poem with the name of the poet or the author or the playwright. And then they should also sort of make mention of the poem that they're dealing with. All of these things I think help, control their mind. Then I immediately say that he critiques and angrily condemns the construction works that is being carried out by a group of city authorities. So I give a synopsis of the poem. So I mentioned the full name of the poet. I mentioned the name of the poem. Then I give a synopsis, like sort of like a brief, what I would describe as a brief summary of the poem before I now start injecting the points in. And the points I mentioned is he blends repetition and short sentences. Then he uses personification, right? Then I say he uses the metaphor of dentistry. Then I talk about the blend of climax and listing. Then I talk about the structure of the poem. The structure of the poem is really, really important if you're going to, you're aiming for an A star. Then I pick the first point. He blends repetition and short sentences. Then I said, Cheng powerfully conveys his irritation with the actions of the group with a blend of repetition and short sentences. So I sort of threw the points there. Then I explain the point, which is the E portion that I mentioned. Right? He blends repetition and short sentence in the quote, the plan they build. His use of two short sentences quickens the actions of the group and shows that it takes a short time for them to plan and build. Then I go on to further explain the point. Also, his repetition of days 6 times in the poem. Now I'm giving like an overview of what I've seen in the poem, right? Of days 6 times in the poem emphasizes that he's not a part of the group and suggests that he's pointing to them with disdain from a distance, or condemnation from afar or from a distance. Now, this is how you write it. Then I go on to say, furthermore, the poet conveys a shock at the actions of the group with personification. The word even communicates that he is shocked that two powerful forces of nature, the sea and the skies, are afraid of the planet. So again, the question that you were asked is, how does Cheng powerfully convey his attitude? He's shocked. The powerful elements of nature that we know, the sea and the skies, are afraid. They are both afraid of the planets. Now, then I explain the personification. So I do not just say use personification, I explain what I mean. I say his use of draws back to describe the response of the sea to the planets shows that it is aware of them and does not want to have a frontal confrontation with them. While his use of surrender to describe how the skies respond to the planets suggests that they raise their hands. So now this is vivid visual imagery now. Right? So I'm not just saying he uses vivid visual imagery. I'm saying I'm giving the effect, because that's key in literature. You have to talk about the effect that a figure of speech creates. So it creates the impression that they raise their hands to sort of show that they are surrendering. So they do not want a frontal response or have like a frontal response with the planners. So they're afraid of them. They're a defeated group. I mean, the skies here, remember, multiple skies. But then more literally, you can talk about the skies as, the building of skyscrapers, and then the seas draws back, and literally, again, you can talk about it as maybe the dredging or land reclamation of sorts. But here, we do not talk about the literal meanings, or I do not write about the literal meaning. I give the figurative meaning. Now, another key thing you should also be able to do when you're writing your essays is to use, multiple conjunctions. And if you need help with writing, you can reach out to me at mrquickesteaches.com. So this is my email address here, mrquickesteaches@gmail.com. My courses are also on Mr. Quickest Teaches. I mean, you can purchase the whole course, or you can just sign up for a month, which is about $40 for the entire poem, where I give analysis of all the poems. So you can do either of that. So then I continue and I say, in addition, Cheng powerfully exposes dislike for the actions of the planets with metaphors of dentistry. You see, now I'm talking about metaphors of dentistry. I've moved the focus of the poem. He describes how the group breaks down unwanted houses as knock-off useless blocks with dental dexterity, which communicates that they are very skilled at what they do and do not damage their adjoining houses. You see how I explained it, metaphors of dentistry. Also, gaps are plugged with gleaming gold suggests that the group have a phobia for open spaces. And it's just like a dentist, Dentists, for example, would put braces to make people's teeth come together. And that's like the impression. That's why he uses metaphors of dentistry here. Now, also, gaps are plugged with gleaming gold suggests that the group have a phobia for open spaces, and the setting appears very shiny. So I'm giving further explanation of the metaphors of dental dentistry that Cheng uses. Upskill and perfect. Then I go on to say that his description of the work of the group suggests that they're in the wrong profession. So they should be dentists, not builders. So again, I've gone back to the question that I was asked about what is his attitude towards the group. Then I go to the next paragraph, I pick the next point, and then I add again also. Now, if you observe something, in the course of the poem, I refer to the poet as Cheng. I refer to him as the poet. And I do all of that to create like some sort of flow. So you do not respond and say Cheng, 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 Bokim, Cheng. I mean, it's going to be too repetitive. So you use, if you know the gender, for example, in this instance, Cheng is male, you say the he, right? Also, the poet shows his disapproval for the actions of the group with a blend of listening and climax. This is another point in another paragraph. Then I explain the point. He says anesthesia, amnesia, hypnosis. Then I explain what anesthesia is. He uses anesthesia to communicate that the group puts in place measures that numbs the citizens to the construction work that they are undertaking in the setting. Then I explain amnesia. Amnesia shows that the group puts in place measures that make the citizens easily forget what the setting was like before. And hypnosis tells that the group have made the citizens to mindlessly agree to the construction works in the setting. Then I conclude, I say his description presents the planners as vile schemers. In fact, you can also add here that if you observe anesthesia in terms of the list, the climax I mentioned, anesthesia is like the least form. Amnesia is like, a more controlling form. The hypnosis is like the highest form of control. A mindless acquires like zombies. Then I go again and I talk about the next thing. I say, finally, Cheng presents his disdain for the actions of the group with a structure. So you have to talk about the structure. And like I mentioned, you can find all 15 poems with the predicted essays that you can fine-tune. Now, the thing about the IGCSE or the GCSE is that if you're given any question with this sample essay that I've given to you, you can just fine-tune it, but the only thing you just have to modify a bit is how you present the points. But then in terms of the explanation and the analysis, you can use the same thing that I've used, and you're going to ace it. You're going to get the A star. Then I say, finally, remember I talked about the use of conjunctions. I put the word finally here. Finally, Cheng presents his disdain for the actions of the group with a structure. And what do I do? And I have to explain the structure. The poem is a free verse and has irregular line length and number in each stanza. Its use of 9 lines in the first stanza communicates that the group is pregnant with ideas. So I use the number 9 there to stand for the fact that the group is pregnant with ideas. Its use of 14 lines, which mimics a sonnet. We know that 14 lines is a sonnet. Shows that he's caricaturing, he's making a joke of it. You know, if you look at the way the poem appears, you see that it's very irregular on the page. So he's caricaturing the construction works of the group and showing that their construction is not as organized as they think. While his use of 4 lines in the third stanza creates the impression that he will remain defiant to the action of the group every quarter of the year. So now I use the number 4 there to indicate each quarter of the year. You know, these are like deeper meanings, and sometimes, or not sometimes, in terms of the AOs, AO1, AO2, AO3, AO4, they look at that, your personal response to the poem. Can you find, beyond surface meaning? Can you give like deeper meaning of the poem? And that's what I do here in the structure. Somebody will just say, well, 9 is of no consequence, 40, but then I've used it here to talk about the structure. Then you have to conclude the poem. It's important that you conclude. Remember, in the GCSE or IGCSE, you have about 45 minutes to write an essay. Then I write here to conclude. Cheng shows his dislike for the actions of the planners with an array of devices. Then I talk about the things I've talked about: repetition, short sentences, personification, metaphor of dentistry, blend of personification and metaphor, blend of climax and listing, and the structure. Then I conclude by saying his attitude makes the reader take a deeper view of how modern cities are built. And if you were able to replicate such a essay in your GCSE or IGCSE, you get an A star. All of this you get for, like I mentioned, for just £35. Then the second poem, the City Planners. This is the poem. This is the question. Explore how attitude conveys a strong emotions about the city planners. Now there are sort of correlations between the city planners and the planners. So the planners, for example, is about what happens or what's happening in a huge city. The city planner is what's happening in a suburb, right? And then in this poem, just like what we saw earlier on in the planners, Atwood is irritated by the actions of a group that she calls the city planners. So she talks about how she's going around on a Sunday day, and then what offends us? So offense there tells us that she's angry. So from the get-go, she tells us her attitude towards it. Now, there are multiple things you can talk about in this poem. She talks about the sanities. So the sanities are things that have been put in place by the group to create an impression that there is sanity in the area. But then, to the planners, there is no sanity. Now, she begins to talk about the levelness of the houses in pedantic rows, the planted sanitary trees. Then she talks about there are certain of levelness of surface like a rebuke. So the entire place is plain. And that irritates her. No shouting here or the shatter of glass. Now, one of the first things that I observe is the control. So one of the things that irritates Atwood is the control of the setting, the control of the noise level in the setting. So no shouting here or shatter of glass, nothing more abroad than the rational whine of a power mower. Observe the personification of the power mower there with the rational whine. So there's this impression that even the inanimate aspects of the setting is wise. Cutting a straight swath in the discouraged grass. The grass, rather, that is supposed to beautify, is discouraged. It looks dead. Maybe drooping, something like that. So the control there is one of the first things that we see. Then she talks about the sideways. So the next thing that she uses is personification. There's a real personification in this poem. But though the driveways, again, you find this essay, the answer to this essay as part of the course. But though the driveways neatly sidestep hysteria by being even, the roofs all display the same slant of avoidance of the hot sky. So there's this sort of cat and mouse or predator-prey action in the setting. So the driveways are trying to avoid or sidestep hysteria. Then the roofs is trying to fight, in the phalanx system. I write about it in the essay. So my advice is that you look at the essay. The smell of oil are faint. So there's this use of olfactory imagery. Then again, another personification, sickness lingering in the garages. I talk about this. So they are waiting. They are waiting to pounce. Then a plastic hose poised in a vicious course. So this is serpentine imagery. Again, this idea that There are elements of viciousness and attack in the setting. Now, one of the past question I saw on this, like the most recent past question on this, on the city planners, is from March 2023. It says, in what ways does Hartwood convey strong emotions about the city planners? So this is the question. That's the question I'm talking about. Then the next thing that we see is that she begins to be prophetic. She sounds prophetic and says that the setting, all of these things that we are seeing is going to implode, is going to be destroyed. And how is it going to? She says, when the houses capsize, will slide obliquely. So that's another key point as well. So she sort of foreshadows what will happen to the setting. Then, in the last 3 stanzas of the poem, that is where the city planners with the insane faces trace it from that stanza. That's the stanza 5, stanza 6, stanza 7. The entire poem is 7 stanzas. 7 is also a number that is tied to perfection. But when you look at it, she tells us that, see, these city planners, they have insane faces. They work individualistically. They do not work. There's no coordination. They are guessing directions. But when they guess the directions, then they do not change what they've guessed. And they are changing the place that she knows. So we see irritation and anger from her voice. So I analyzed this in detail in my analysis. You can see the cause. I'm going to put it in the description field. For the whole month, you can get that, study it, listen to the analysis to prepare you, and also look at the essay as well. And I think you'll be fine. You just easily achieve the A star. So I'll put the A star quality of this explorer attitude conveys strong emotions as well there. Now, the third poem we see is The Man with Night Sweat by Tom Gunn. Now, the question that I'm thinking could be brought is, how does Gunn strikingly present the persona's despair in The Man with Night Sweats? Now, one of the key things about this poem is that the poem opens and then the poetic voice or the speaker appears to have just woken up from sleep. So he wakes up with a startle. So multiple elements that you can talk about is the use of juxtaposition. The juxtaposition of cold and heat. The juxtaposition of wake up and dreams. Then you can talk about actions and consequences. I will prosper through dreams of heat. Wake up to their residue. What are the action? He prospered through dreams of heat. That's his action. What are the consequences? Wake up to their residue, sweat, and a clinging sheet. So this poetic voice appears to have lived a very kamikaze kind of life in the past. But now he has to live with the consequences of his actions. I grew as I explored the body I could trust, even while I adored the risk that made robust. So you find the essay quality, A-star quality, essay on this. How does Gunn strikingly present the persona's despair? Again, as I talk about this analysis, I talk about the structure as well. So if you observe, the poem has a rhyme scheme, an A-B rhyme scheme, C-C. So you see that who, residue, heat, sheets, they rhyme. So what impressions you can, for me, the key thing, as part of the essay that I've written, it's like the poetic voice comes across as this person that is trying to tell us as his life, right? His life is like a cautionary tale that we shouldn't forget. And so he makes it music-like for us. So that's one of the explanations that I give, but then I go in more detail as I talk about it in the essay. And my advice is that you get the course that has all the essays for the 15 poems. Try to look at it, try to practice it, try to practice it. Go to the exam, modify it a bit, and then write it and then achieve your A star, or your grade 9 or your grade 8, depending, on the marking unit that is used in your school. Now, the fourth poem is, again, just like the third, Night Sweat by Robert Lowell. Now, but this poem is a bit more dense. I go into detail about this poem in my analysis. You can find it at Mr. Quickest Teaches. But in this poem, Robert Lowell, the speaker, begins to tell us about the experience that he has. The poem opens quite innocently. In fact, when you look at the first 3 lines of the poem, it's quite innocent. Work table, letter, book, standing lap, playing things, my stored equipment, the old broom, but I'm living in a tidy room. And then the poem shifts for 10 nights now. So the poetic voice just shifts the poem abruptly. I felt the creeping down float over my pajamas rated white. So there's this sense, again, the use of personification, creeping down. I explained this point in detail in I can't do all of that because I've explained it as part of the analysis. In fact, you can see the samples of it on my YouTube channel. But then in the essay, I explain what to do if you're sitting in the exam. Because sometimes students think they have like an idea of the poem, but they don't. Right? So the personification of the creeping damp, the personification of sweet salt embalms me. So this idea of death, he's alive. Everything streams and tells me. So the blend there of personification, which we see in, tells me this is right, and then metaphor, everything streams. So you see that the blend of those are things that you can write about in the essay, because the question, for example, that is here is, explore the ways in which law strikingly conveys the thoughts and feelings of the speaker in Night Sweat. So for the Night Sweat, this is the question that I saw. How does Law strikingly convey his feelings in Night Sweat? So and then another question that you may be asked in either the Night Sweat or the Man with Night Sweat is how the poet makes you feel sympathy. Again, with the essay that is part of the course, you can just look at it and then you can modify it. And if you need any help or assistance, you can reach out to me, Mr. Quickest Teaches at gmail.com. Or you can even reach me via text or telegram on this number. So then, now the thing about this poem is that the poem is actually two poems in one. Because from line 15, we see a shift, or what can be described as a volta. Behind me, the poetic voice begins to speak to some other person, his wife. Again, I feel the light lighted my light. I feel the light lighting my lidded eyelids. So she appears to be like this person that comes with light. And with her appearance, darkness and death. Because for me, I see like the carriage of death, for example, when he talks about gray-skulled horses winding for the suit of night. For me, that's like the carriage of death. But then her appearance sort of makes them run off, because she comes with this palpable, powerful light. Again, I speak about these things in the essay, because more often than not, because of the density of this poem, students tend to stick on the first sonnet, what can be described as the first sonnet, but then there are other portions of it as well. And then the way he describes himself metaphorically as a heap of wet clothes, seamy, shivering. What impressions does that give? So if you're asked, explore the ways in which Lowell strikingly conveys the thoughts and feelings, the wordlessness that he feels. I dabble in the dapple of the day. Then again, he talks about a child inside of him. So the urn, we see that he says in this urn. So he sees himself as a container or something that houses a dead. And that idea is seen multiple times. We see it when he says there, always inside me is a child who died. That's line 11. Always inside me is his will to die. But then when you go to the second portion of it, it says, my child exploding into dynamite. So he's free. My wife, your likeness alters everything. So you see the shift in the tone of the poetic voice. So this appearance of his wife sort of exorcises death and frees him from what he's been feeling all along. Now, the next question is on rain. Explore how Thomas movingly presents the thoughts and feelings of the speaker in the poem. So again, in that same idea that we see in the Man with Night Sweat, we see it as well in rain. Now, one of the key things about this poem is the repetition of the word rain multiple times. And then there are multiple adjectives with which it is described. Midnight rain is described as wild rain twice. So we see that in the first line of the poem, and we also see that as well in the 15th line as well. Then there are other ideas in the poem that is modified, and then there's also the use of personification, stroke, other poetic devices. So when you see the personification and solitude and me, so solitude is personified. And when I read this poem, the poem that came to my mind was because I could not stop for death. So the courage held but ourselves and immortality. right? So we see the use of personification here. And another key thing you have to be able to talk about is the use of the repetition of this word solitude. Again, I write about it in the essay. So in the essay on this. So, and then there's another variant of it here when it talks about in line 10 when it says solitary. So how does explore how Thomas movingly presents the thoughts and feelings of the speaker in the poem? And as part of the essay, and my advice is that you get it, you look at it, A-star quality essay. And one of the key things I saw in this poem is thanatophobia. So the speaker is obsessed with death and dying. I write about it as well. So when you look at the third line, for example, uses the word here, die. Then when you go to the seventh line, say dead. Then he goes to the ninth line, says dying. Then he comes here as well and he says dead. Then he says later on death. So you see that there are multiple instances in the poem where the poetic voice is speaking about death. So the speaker is obsessed with death and dying. In fact, he concludes the poem by saying that if love it be for what is perfect and cannot, the tempest tells me disappoint. So to him, death is the only thing that is perfect and cannot disappoint him. And observe the slyness of the poetic voice. He does not only speak about, the title of the poem is Rain, and then it talks about rain, like I've mentioned multiple times. He mentions it, the rains upon and all of that. But now he shifts it. And the final line of that's the 18th line, says, the tempest tells me. So the tempest is a more formidable, powerful, presentation of rain. So there's this sense that he's able to speak both to the rain, because if you look at the poem, it says, and neither hear the rain, the fourth line, and neither hear the rain nor give it thanks. So he has this ability to communicate. I write about it extensively, an A-star quality essay in the course. Just get it and see how I do the work. And I can't, because there's a free content and I have to stick to time, I can't exhaust all of these. But then in the final line, it says, the tempest tells me disappoint. And the question, like I mentioned, is explore how Thomas movingly presents the thoughts. So they can ask you for how Thomas makes you feel sympathy for the speaker. Now, the fifth poem is one of my favorite poems. Is The Spirit is Too Blunt an Instrument by Anne Stevenson. Now, in this poem, Stevenson talks about the wonder of the birth of a baby and the method with which the system through which a baby is born. Now, most students, when they read the poem, think that she's talking about machine or, creating the baby. No, that's not what she's trying to say. She's trying to say here that it's not a spirit that is a particular spirit or the spirit that creates the baby, but there's a coming together of man and woman in sex. And one of the key things about this poem is the use of multiple adjectives. So I speak, for example, in the essay, her use of, microbiological terms. Right? She talks about the tiny blind bones, manipulating tendons, the resilient fine meshes of ganglia and vertebrae. So I talk about that. Then another important point in this poem is the tone of the poem. So Stevenson sounds like somebody who is, commanding, very imperative tone. Observe, and then she says, imagine, and then she says, the name any passion. So she's daring the speaker. The listeners. Now, even though this poem, there's no use of the second person point of view, we do not see you in the poem. For me, when I read the poem, I think that the poetic voice is speaking directly to me or to a listener. So the question here is, how does Stevenson strikingly present the wonder of new life in the poem? And then the key aspect of the poem is the structure of the poem. Each of the stanzas, which are 3, is Spencerian or 9-line stanzas. So that tells us that she's talking about pregnancy, right? And then the 3 stanzas, for me, comes across as the 3 trimesters of a birth or a pregnancy. So what happens? So she talks about all of these important body parts that are created, and then in the last portion of it, She says it's left to the vagaries of the mind to invent love and despair and anxiety. So the mind, the human mind, is like a mad scientist. It's left to its vagaries. You can look at the A-star quality essay that presented how does Stevenson strikingly present the wonder of new life in this poem. Or they can ask you, for example, how does Stevenson make this such an unforgettable poem? That's a more broad-based question that you can work with. Then the next poem is From Long Distance. And the question on it is, how does Harrison powerfully present grief in From Long Distance? So, for example, in the first stanza, if you observe, the poetic voice tells us about what he thinks about it, about the death of his mother and what his father thinks. He appears to be in acceptance, though my mother was already 2 years dead. But then his father appears to be in denial, kept sleepers warming by the gas, put hot water bottles aside of the bed, still went to renew a transport pass. So you see that there's this sort of difference, contrast in the way the poetic voice is mourning his mother and how his father is mourning. And then the second stanza says, you couldn't just drop in, you had to phone. He put you off an hour. So we see the action that his father takes as his father mourns. Then in the third stanza, he tells us that in the first stanza of the poem, he tells us that his father expects his mother to return. So that's a third thing in terms of the stanzas, I write that in the essay. And then in the final stanza, it says, I believe life ends with death. We see that his words and his actions do not match. I believe life ends with death, and that's all. That comes across as somebody who is certain. Then he now goes on and says, you haven't both gone shopping, just the same. In my new black leather phone book, that's your name, and the disconnected number is still called. So we see that just like his father, he begins to act as if his parents were still alive. So the question of how does Harrison powerfully present grief? So you can talk about his presentation of the variance or the difference between the poetic voice and his father. You can talk about his father's attitude to grief in the second stanza. You can talk about his father's belief, because that tells us that he's in denial, strong denial. And then we can also talk about the fact that in the final stanza, we see that the poetic voice, just like his father, begins to grieve the death. Around this point, both his parents are dead. Again, to get a fuller understanding of how I answer the question, please look at the essay that I present. Now, the next poem is Funeral Blues. Just like Tony Harrison's From Long Distance, this also deals with grief as well, death and grief. These are key themes in Funeral Blues and also From Long Distance. Now, in this poem, W.H. Auden talks about the death of a nameless individual, a man. And his tone is very, very, very imperative. In fact, in the first stanza of the poem, he advocates for a very, very, very silent show of grief. And the predicted question is, in what ways does Auden make the reader sympathize with the poetic voice in Funeral Blues? Now, for May-June 2023, the question I was given is, how does Auden convey the speaker's grief in this poem? How does Auden convey the speaker's grief in this poem? Yes, and then for long distance, from long distance, like I mentioned already, let me just see this a bit. The predicted question I have is, how does Harrison powerfully present grief in From Long Distance? But then for October, November, the question that was given in 11, that's 1-1, was explore the ways in which Harrison powerfully depicts his father's reaction to his mother's death. So I have the essay on this. Now let's go back to Funeral Blues. So in the first stanza of the poem, the poetic voice, you say, in what ways does Auden make the reader sympathize with the poetic voice? I think one of the key things that he does is the oscillation in the tone of the poetic voice. So in the first stanza, he advocates for a very, very silent show of grieving, right? Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, so no communication, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Not even animals are allowed to make noise. Silence the pianos with muffled drum. So silence, graveyard-like silence. I'm lowering my voice for effect. Then, in the second stanza, it says, let aeroplanes circle morning overhead. Screaming on the sky the message, he is dead. Put crib bows around the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. So this is like a more public show of, grief. So silence, then public show. So that tells us that his emotions are all over the place. Then the third stanza says, he was my north. So we see the use of multiple metaphorical attribution to the deceased. So he starts in the first line, line 9, with the cardinal points, the 4 cardinal points. It was my north, my south, my east, and west. So the person was like his sort of direction. Then my working week, my Sunday rest. So the person, was a manifestation of his week. My noon, the highest point of his life. My midnight, the darkest point of his life. My talk, my song. So whatever you would think of, the person was that to me. And then see how he ends it. He says, I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. So that makes the reader sympathize with him. So he shifts in the third stanza, focused, on the deceased, on the dead man. Then he goes on in the final stanza with a voice of anguish and what can be described as a very fatalistic tone and says, the stars are not wanted now, put out everyone. So just imagine the stars in the night, they've gone off. Pack up the moon. The moon is packed up. No light from the moon at night. Dismantle the sun. The entire earth is thrown into darkness. Then he says, pour away the ocean, sweep up the wood. So you see his fatalistic tone. Now, another key thing you have to talk about in terms of this poem as well is the structure of the poem. Just like in this poem as well. Dead, gas. So we see the use of A-B rhyme scheme. Phone, alone, time, crime. So I speak about, I give you the essay on it. Disbelief, grief, key, T, all, call. Now, I think I failed to mention this. One of the key devices that we see from long distance is the switch and the rhyme scheme in the final stanza. So all other stanzas were A, B, right? So there's this sort of rhythmic and C, D, E, F. But then in the final stanza, he now says all call. So we see that A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. So he changes his tune or his tone about death in the final stanza. That's a key portion, and I explained that point quite effectively in the essay. About how does it, so the structure is very, very important. How does present grief? The structure. The fact that sometimes when people die, we have like all the sort of high sounding things that we see. When is now our turn, then we switch. The same thing as well in this poem as well. So we see the use of the rhyme scheme, phone, bone, drum, come. So we see it's very rhythmic. Like something like a dirge. A dirge or eulogy. And to have like a proper understanding of how I explain these points, please get the essay on it. Very good essay. Essay on it. And you can also sign up for the course to listen to my analysis, because there I break it into detail very nicely. And then you can blend that with the essay and then you're good to go. Invariably, you can essentially teach yourself. Now, the next poem is in Never Expected Much. Now, in this poem, for example, the poetic voice tells us about his relationship with the personified world. And you see that the world there, the W in world is capitalized to make that point, right? So he personifies the world. He says, well, world, you've kept faith with me. So, and then in the first 4 lines, he talks about his relationship with the world and how the world has kept his word. Then in the first stanza from lines 5 to line 8 of the first stanza, he begins to talk about the nature of his relationship, the length of the relationship with the personified world. Then later on in the second stanza, it tells us about what the world has said. And he does that to tell us that he knows the world intimately. And there are multiple uses of quotations. It was then you said, and since I've said, time since I've said, in that mysterious voice. So he knows how the voice of the world sounds and where it comes from. It comes from clouds and hills around. Then he tells us what the world told him. Many have loved me. So the world tells him that many have loved me desperately, many with smooth serenity. So those who love the world, live a very good life. A life with smooth serenity. But while some have shown contempt of me till they dropped underground. So it's almost as if, again, the use of juxtaposition as well. So those who love the world and those who hate the world. I do not promise over my child, over my child. The poet, the world, personified world calls him child. Just neutral tinted harps and such. So the world tells him that, see, I do not promise people things I cannot fulfill. But then neutral tinted, everything that happens to you is neutral tinted. Depending on how you act towards it, it can either be positive or negative. And he ends the poem by saying, wise warning for your credit's sake, which I for one fail not to take. And what's the effect of it? And hence could stem such strain and ache as each ache might assign. So it's like the word has given him some sort of like a secret on how to live in this world. And the question that I've given here is, how does Heidi strikingly present the relationship between the speaker and nature he never expected much? Again, you can get the essay, modify it for effect. Now, in terms of the structure of the poem, if you observe, the second, the fourth, and then the eighth line in each of the stanzas is indented. And I think Heidi does that, or the poetic voice does that, to show that when it comes to life, life is unpredictable. You know, the way one person experiences life, that's not how a second person experiences life. So how does Heidi strikingly present, for me, that's a predicted question, how does Heidi strikingly present the relationship between the speaker and nature in He Never Expected Much? And the third, the next poem is The Telephone Call. Now, The Telephone Call is one of the longer poems. And for me, this is the only poem, like I mentioned, that I have not seen yet for 2023. Because when I looked at from March to October, November 2023, all 14 of the questions have been seen. I have seen. In fact, in Never Expected Much, the question is, you see that in October, November 2023, even though I don't think it's one of the publicized essays. Question. It says, in what ways does Heidi strikingly convey the speaker's memories of the poem? Now, in The Telephone Call, there's this hoax call between the speaker and this group for universal lottery, and it's quite funny. And one of the key things I see in the poem is the oscillation. The change in the speaker's attitude to the callers. She's initially doubtful of them, then she reacts positively, then she begins to ask question them, and then they tell her that, well, it's just a prank. So my predicted question here is, explore how Adcock makes the conversation between the people for universal lotteries and the poetic voice so unforgettable in The Telephone Call. Or they can even ask you, how does Adcock make this such an unforgettable poem? Right. So you talk about, and then the use of multiple direct speech. So we see multiple direct speech, and we see, it's like a conversation. Even though the poetic voice uses, or the poet uses poetic license and does not put the when one speaker is speaking in one line and then the next. That's one of the things that we learned, in basic school. But we see here there's a fusion. Oh, they said there's no check, but the money, we don't deal with money. So here, that's the speaker that is speaking, even though it's in the same line. So I mean, because it's a poem, we see the use of poetic license. And then in terms of the rhyme scheme, each of the stanzas have 8 lines. So that's like octet stanzas, right? And then again, there's an A-star quality essay on this. A-star or grade 9, grade 8, A quality. I mean, get it, practice it. The more you practice it, the better. Then a consumer's report. So a consumer's report. So for a consumer's report, the question that I have here is, how does Potter present the speaker's attitude to life in the consumer's report? So how does Potter present the speaker's attitude to life in a consumer's report? So when you read a consumer's report, you hear this speaker critiquing life. He talks negatively about life. Negative. Then towards the end of it, he now says, so finally I'll buy it. So there's an essay on it. So in terms of the predicted question, this is the predicted question. How does Potter powerfully present the speaker's attitude to life in the consumer's report? And in terms of the structure of the poem, the first stanza, it just gives us an introduction of, that he's answered a questionnaire, and then he goes on to say that, keep my answers confidential. It's important that I keep my answers confidential. And then he goes on this long rant. He talks about he got it as a gift. He talks about how life is, like a product. Reducing as a product is economical. It's expensive. There are too many rules. He wants it to be the same. I mean, it was just created so that the owner will have a job. I explain these details in the essay. Now, the next question is request to a year. Now, in request to a year, Wright talks about her great-great-grandmother. And one of the key things I observe is the appellations with which she described a great-great-grandmother, legendary devotee of the arts. And then she goes on here later on to tell us that she has an isolating eye. Now, in the event of the day is that her great-grand-uncle is on the cusp of death. I mean, precipice is almost falling off. I give explanation of this as part of the course. My advice is that you get the course and also get the essays as well, right? And the question I've put here, how does Wright present a compelling image of womanhood in request to a year? Now, for this question, it was brought in May 2023, and the question is, how does Wright vividly convey the speaker's admiration for a great-great-grandmother? But how does, woman, because they can just switch the question a bit, and you can answer on it. Again, there's an essay on it, right? And if you observe, for this, in terms of the structure of the poem, we see that these are like quartets, quatrain stanzas. So 3-line stanza, 3-line stanzas, 3-line stanzas. So I mean, forgive this thing here. It is actually one stanza, right? And then this is another stanza, and this is another stanza. But then the final stanza is a couplet stanza. And observe the use of planned and hand. So there's this rhythm there. So that sort of creates the impression that the poetic voice is also gaining mastery. The kind of what she's asking for, her great-grandmother's, the feminist of her great-great-grandmother's hand, she's getting it. And again, I present the essay there. How does Wright present a compelling image of womanhood in request to a year? Then the next question is on finding a small fly crushed in a book by Charles Tennyson Turner. So the poem, in the poem, Turner tells us about this dead fly and uses the metaphor of the dead fly to advise us humans. So you're going to see the shift in the point of view of the poem. So the poem is written in what can be described as early modern English. Some hand that never meant to do thee hurt has crushed thee here between these pages spent. So the way he talks about the brutality of death is a key aspect. So death is a key theme there. The unpredictability of death, the fact that we cannot tell when death will occur. And then he also the fact that when it comes to legacy is something that is long term. It can stay for a long time, legacy. And then the fact that we should fight for a legacy that would be admirable. The question is, explore how Turner makes on finding a small fly crushed in a book such a memorable poem. So about death, key theme, legacy, right? And this is also part of the essays that is part of the course. Now, the 14th poem is Ozymandias. This is one of the older poems. Again, it comes across as early modern English. And then it talks about this poetic voice who talks about this dead king. So the poem starts, but we say, I met a traveler from an antique land who said too vast. So he gives us a description of the setting, a very important part. And time is also another key theme as well. So the description of the setting is one of the things I write about in the essay. And then the description of the visage or the face of Ozymandias, right? Whose frown, wrinkled lip, snare of cold command. There's this arrogance in his attitude. And another key thing that we also see in the poem is the voice, the fact that we hear directly from King Ozymandias. And we see that in lines 10 and 11. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look at my works, ye mighty and despair. So the arrogance, the fact that we can hear from the dead king is quite formidable. And then, quite ironically, the poetic voice tells us, nothing beside remains. Run the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sound stretched far away. So the irony that all the things he's arrogant about, in fact, he confers on himself the title of King of Kings. And one of the questions I see about it from March 2023 is, how does Shelley create vivid impressions of the ruined statue? And the question I have here is, what vivid impressions of King Ozymandias does Shelley create for you in this poem? So this is the predicted question. You can try this question, look at the essay that I've written, practice on it, and you can do something excellent with it. And then we look at the poem, and we look at the rhyme scheme. The fact that the rhyme scheme is all over the place. Again, another cautionary tale that we shouldn't be arrogant for power. That power, it's just a matter of time. We're going to lose all the power. Again, I answered this question: what vivid impressions of King Ozymandias does Shelley create for you in this poem as part of essays? Then the final poem, A Way Melancholy. And in this poem, Smith uses modern English, early modern English, right? And then we see the use of multiple rhetorical questions. So the poem comes across as very dark, because we see that melancholy is sort of accosting the poetic voice, following her wherever she goes. But then she starts off by saying, away melancholy, away with it, let it go. She wants melancholy exercise. Leave me alone, get away. And I think the more she says it, right, the more the melancholy physically moves away from her. Then she uses, you see the use of rhetorical questions here. And not the trees green, so she points to elements in nature. Does not the wind blow? The 4 elements in nature, away melancholy. Then she gives us multiple antidotes to exorcising melancholy. Now, one of the questions I saw on Away Melancholy is, in what ways does Smith convey feelings of hope in Away Melancholy? And I think one of the key things, if you're writing this kind of a question, or even this question that I've written here, how does Smith powerfully communicate the speaker's attitude to melancholy? One of the things you should know is that there is disdain and irritation and anger. Get away from me, kind of. But then she does that by pointing to nature, right? The nature, the 4 elements in nature. Then she talks about an ant, right? So here she sort of personifies the ants. Again, I explained these points in the essay. A-star quality or grade 9 essay. Then she talks about man. Then she talks about man, the fact that man should realize, one of the ways you can exercise melancholy is to realize that you are an apex creature. You are superlative. You are the highest form of, man is the only one who raises a stone, which is the metaphor for man is the only one who creates a religion. Then she goes in the next stanza and says, see, don't allow melancholy to speak to you about tears, tyranny, pox, wars. All of these topics are topics that are bound to make you melancholic. Instead, talk about good things. The fact that man is growing, man's doing good. And then she goes on in this 9th stanza to say, the 8th stanza, she says, man aspires to good, to love. So those are the things that man aspires to. Let's talk about his virtues, not his vices. Then she goes on and says, beating corrupted. For me, this is one of the most powerful images in the poem, which for me, that thing about hope. Man is beaten, man is corrupted, man is dying in his own blood, lying. And that is the portion where we see the use of, quite rhythmic language, the lying and dying, above love. But then while man is in that state that has been beaten to the point where he's almost dying, he heaves up an eye above, and then he cries, love, love. I explained this point as part of the course. You can get the course. If you're writing it, the exam in May 2024, you can just subscribe to it for a month, and you listen to the analysis and also look at the essay as well. That Baban cries, heaves an eye above and cries, love, love. Then she now says, it is man's virtue that needs explaining, not his failing. Away melancholy, away with it. Let it go. So the question I have is, how does Smith powerfully communicate the speaker's attitude to melancholy in the poem? All of these 15 poems I've mentioned, like I've already said, I have them there using the PE system, the PEE system, PEL system, that's PEEL, and then the PEA system as well. And like I've already shown, this is like a sample essay for the planners. It's quite detailed. You look at it, you just modify it a bit, and then you are good to go, and you can achieve either an A-star, right, or a grade 9 or a grade 8 or an A I mean, I've done this for 13 years, and there's an array of students that have gone through my hands, even those who do not like literature, and then they've ended up getting an A star. And thank you so much for joining the lesson. If you need to reach out to me, like I mentioned, you can reach out to me on WhatsApp or Telegram. That's my phone number there. And then, or you can even do me an email on mrquickesteaches@gmail.com. Until the next lesson, bye-bye. See you.